With the first concept, that is, see, we are going to start with the conceptual database design using the entity relationship models, or you can say the ER models. So for that, first of all, we need to study some of the basic terminologies which we use in the ER model. And let me write down the topic name. It is the conceptual database design. Conceptual database design using the entity relationship model. Using the entity relationship model. Using the entity relationship model. Okay. So this is the conceptual database design. So in the conceptual database design, so first of all, we have to study what are the different components of ER model. What are the different components of ER models? These components act as a basic terminologies which we use thoroughly or throughout the ER model. You must have studied these terminologies before. So the first terminology is called as the entity. What exactly is an entity? So an entity represents an object in the real world. An entity represents an object in the real world. In the real world. Okay. So for example, we have nouns, students, objects, books, accounts. These things are entity, right? Or this is this one more definition of entity. That means objects like these entities are representing some things. For example, we may be having an entity as a student. A student is an entity. In the same way, we may be having an entity as a book. A book is an entity. Here, student and the book, both of them are acting as a physical entity. Are acting as a physical entity in the real world, right? In the same way, we may be having an entity called as account. When I'm saying account, now this account is acting as a logical entity in a real world. It is acting as a logical entity in a real world. Okay. So next thing is what is called as an entity set. What is called as an entity set? So entity set is a collection of similar entities. Entity set is also called as collection of similar entities. Similar entities. Okay, like we have students, right? So student is, now if we just take one single student, that is kind of an entity because that is representing an object. But if we take some collection of similar students or again similar objects, then it is called as entity set. So this entity set is generally represented by a rectangle like this. It is represented by a rectangle. Now this rectangle is representing a student as an entity set, right? Next is we have something called as relationships. Something called as relationships. Relationships. Okay. So the relationship can also be called as what is the association among different entities. As a relationship generally defines or denotes what is the association among different entities. Among the entities, it is called as the relationships. Okay. Now for example, we have reading or buying. These are called as relationship, like reading or buying or buying. These are representing the relationships. Okay. So when I'm saying reading and buying, for example, if you have a book and a student, then student may be reading the book, or someone may be buying something, a person may be buying something, right? So that is why the relationships are generally represented with the verbs and entities are generally represented with nouns. Entities are generally represented with nouns and the relationships are generally represented with the verbs. Okay. And then we have something called as relationship set. Relationship set. So what is a relationship set? Relationship set is the collection of similar relationships. The collection of similar relationships. So these relationship sets are generally denoted by a diamond like figure. So if I am going to draw it, so it will be something like this. We'll be having a diamond like figure, right? And this diamond like figure, for example, we have something, the relationship like book, or you can say read. So read is representing a relationship set. It is representing a relationship set. Now the next definition is related to what are called as attributes. What are called as attributes. Okay, so attributes are things which describes an entity or which gives the properties of an entity. These are things which describes an entity, which describes an entity. They are called as attributes, right? For example, we may be having a student as an entity, and these attributes are generally denoted in oval shape. Okay, so assume this is a student. This is an entity which is representing a student. Now we may be having different attributes of these students. Okay, so like I'm going to represent it like this. Okay, so these are the attributes of the student entity. So we can have a student attribute like a student can have a roll number, a student can have a name, a student can have a branch in which it is studying. So these are the things which are describing this particular attribute. In the same way, generally if I'm saying attribute means we have name or age of a person, right? These things represent the attributes for a person. Okay, now we can represent these things related to a person. For example, if I am saying a student, now for the student I can represent the same information like this. We have student as an entity. In student entity we have roll number, we have name, and we have branch. We have roll number, name, and branch. Now this is representing something called as intention. But if I'm going to give you an exact values, like if I'm saying the roll number is 26, name is Himanshu, and branch is computer science. Now these are the exact values. Now this is also called as extension. It is also called as extension. So intention means I'm just representing that the entity is student, and these are the attributes of the student. Now if I take a particular instance that roll number 26, name Himanshu, branch computer science, and this particular instance is also called as extension. Okay, now these attributes can be classified into different types. You can say attributes, there are different classifications of attributes. That is called as classification of attributes. So you can say attributes can be classified into different types. Like we can have a simple attribute, we can have a composite attribute, we can have a composite attribute, then we can have something called as a single valued attribute, or we can have something called as a multi-valued attribute. We can have something called as a stored attribute, or we can have a derived attribute. And we can have something called as a complex attribute. Again I am repeating, we have a simple attribute, composite attribute, single valued attribute, multi-valued attribute, stored attribute, derived attribute, composite attribute, or complex attribute, and we can also have something called as a key attribute. In the next video, let us look at about what are these different kinds of attributes, what is a simple attribute and composite, etc.